thanks for having this conversation with us about Taiwan, democracy, and digital democracy. We're super excited to get started, and we have so many questions. But before jumping into it, our community asked us to relay some state-level, super important questions to you. So, Andrea, do you want to get started?
I'm ready, and these are very important questions. So, would you go for tea or bubble tea?
Well, bubble tea contains tea.
If you had a choice between good food or a stable internet connection, which one would you choose?
A stable internet connection that lets me order good food?
Star Wars or Star Trek?
Both. So may the force be with you and live long and prosper.
Okay.
I like the combination. Blue pill or red pill?
Both. I'll definitely take both.
So you want the truth and then you want to forget the truth.
That's right. That's the cyber physical systems, right? In both worlds.
Fun. So now we are actually ready to jump into the main question.
Into the small talk.
So let's talk first about history and democracy in Taiwan. We know that in 1996, the first presidential election took place. We know it was also the year of the internet in Taiwan and many other places. And since then, we can confidently say that democracy blossomed across Taiwan. Why do you think that in such a short time, democracy took such a strong hold in Taiwan and is still thriving?
I think there's two main reasons. One is that democracy is very new. So we started with democracy as a form of technology that everyone can improve on. So instead of a tradition that's passed by grandparents, people simultaneously tried participatory budget, referendums, sortitions, juries, anything that you can think about in the past few decades. Taiwan probably has tried on some scale or the other. And so it made democracy not something from top down, but something that can be experimented upon and collaborated upon. So that's the first thing. It increased the participation rate. And I think the second reason is that Taiwan wants to be seen as different from our past, because our parents' generation, our grandparents' generation did fight to win those freedoms. So we need to put those freedoms to good use. Moreover, we see that around the world, democracy is on the backslide. So much as how we export agricultural technology or medical technology or things like that, we also want to let Taiwan be seen as more unique in the world by fusing digital and democracy together as one of our exports to fight the infodemic and the pandemic, for example, with this Taiwan model.
No, it's amazing to see how the fact that the internet and the first elections kind of came together enabled democracy to thrive so fast. So why do you think other Asian countries, for example, that might have had followed such a path didn't? Why do you think that Taiwan is so unique in the way it leveraged the internet and technology for democracy?
No, I wouldn't say they're not on the path. I work quite closely with the Japanese government, both the metropolitan ones and the central government's committees and professors, and they're definitely on the same path. I think Taiwan is seen as, I guess, a highlight, not because we're on the path that's more right than Japan. I wouldn't say that, but rather because there's simply more interest from the general population. Average teenager or 20-something in Taiwan feels more empowered, have a more of a say in the democratic process compared to a person in the same age in Japan, probably nowadays. But that's not because Japan is not doing digital transformation or participatory democracy or things like that. It's simply that Taiwan is more agile in the sense that in each level of the jurisdiction, from city, municipal, the entire country, and so on, there's multiple levels of engagement for someone who are in their teens or 20-year-old age bracket. And because these kind of people, digital native, kind of have more say in international realms. So if you just look at social media and so on, it seems that Taiwan is more cool with bubble teas, explaining digital democracy and so on, simply because there's more youth engagement and participation. But although we give an impression that we're very hip and cool and so on, actually we are supported by many like-minded jurisdictions, including Japan, but also Australia and so on, to name a few, that are broadly speaking on the same path.
Fantastic. And just out of curiosity, do you think that the fact that obviously there's a stark contrast between Taiwan and communist China and this weight on the mind of citizens and so on, do you think this factor has accelerated the adoption of democracy and also the care that people had for democracy.
I think it made our commitment to democracy more well-rounded. That is to say, it's not that the ruling party is for a certain sense of digital democracy or open government, and the opposition party is not for it. It's not like that, right? All the four major parties in our parliament signed on the Open Parliament National Action Plan, and all made digital democracy and civic participation part of their agenda. They compete on being more open, right, from the state to the citizens. And that's partly because if someone advocates the reverse, like making the citizen transparent to the state, it will be a non-starter. People will simply say, oh, do you want to go back to the martial law, or do you want to be like the PRC jurisdiction? And that would not have any political clouds, right? So that means that we get to focus our energy on the practicality of actually improving democracy, not to debate on some ideological spectrum of, whether this is populism or just popularism or things like that. We actually get to do things.
That's very interesting, because I was just thinking yesterday while preparing this conversation that, for example, in Eastern Europe, there was a similar path, right? Like countries got freed from an oppressor in a different way, but in a similar time frame. And we saw democracy thriving, but also democracy declining very fast. And in countries like Hungary, Poland, there are definitely challenges to the rule of law, to democracy. And so we're wondering whether this is something that you fear could also happen in Taiwan if, for example, the wrong government come in power, or there is a populist trying to take over, and so on.
Yeah, of course, many people worry about, for example, the infodemic or divisiveness on social media. I mean, we worry about the same things that you folks worry also in any other liberal democratic polities. But I think the main difference in feeling is that all of our major parties supports investing in the digital infrastructures to mitigate those issues or to radically redesign the infrastructure so there's no such issues to begin with. For example, all the major parties supported this town hall style deliberation platform called the GOV, the TW, that already counts more than 30 million in a country of 23 million. That's a lot. And we all say maybe it has its shortcomings, but the parliament also want to adopt petitioning system of this kind, initially only in administration, but now they're also planning to set up their own system because they see it as a much more civil place to have a parliamentary level such suggestion conversation compared to the more antisocial corners of, say, Facebook, which is the digital equivalent of a nightclub, right? So the point here is that we also have our challenges, but our response tends to be constructive in the sense that with the right investment, we trust our citizens and our civic innovators to come up with something that's better than the status quo.
That's great to hear. Thanks for the history of Taiwan in a few minutes. I think it's very useful for everyone across the world to learn more about it as well. We tend to have a lot of misconceptions and lack of understanding of Taiwan. I wanted to move on a bit to more modern history. So if I'm not mistaken, in 2014, the Sunflower Movement started to happen and you were actively involved in it. So I wanted to know if you could tell us how it's relevant to digital democracy, what the Sunflower Movement meant, and how you became involved in it. Because I know that you went then from hacker to minister.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if we remember, 2014 is the year of live streaming. Like large-scale live streaming simply did not exist without specialized equipment. And so I think that is the first time in the Occupy Parliament movement in 2014 in Taiwan, completely peaceful, that everyone who could not make it to the occupied parliament or the streets around parliament nevertheless feel a kind of teleco-presence in the sense that they feel that they're still there and their suggestions could make a change. And there's people who just devote themselves to typing everything that happens in the live stream cameras in all the corners of the parliament, where the various aspects, at least 20 aspects of the Cross-Strait Service and Trade Agreement or CSSTA, were being deliberated on the street. So this showed conclusively that with good facilitators, with good facilitating infrastructure, 500,000 people on the street and many more online, when they put their minds to it, can actually produce good enough consensus. The head of the parliament essentially ratifying all the 4 demands. That's crowdsourced from the street. And so it's a demonstration, not demonstration against. It's not a protest against something. It's a demonstration for something as a demo, right? So for a sense of digital democracy. So nowadays we call it a proof of existence, right? Or the proof of concept. We can't really say digital democracy doesn't work because everyone who has participated in the sunflower movement see the initial kind of budding sense of digital democracy on one particular topic. So we've been just kind of scaling it out, scaling it up, scaling it deeply, but the initial seed was there. And my involvement is simply to ensure that the communication network works with a group of people called G0V or Gov0, a civic technologies community in Taiwan that hopes to fork the government, meaning take the government digital services and make better open versions of it.
But that's super interesting. Thank you, Audrey. And I think it's especially interesting because in many other countries you see, people protesting, people trying to bring the same demands, but you don't see a hacker being turned into a minister very easily. So can you tell us a bit more about the personal side and how did it happen that the government contacted you and brought you directly first as a minister without portfolio?
Well, it's not unheard of in other countries. There's pirate parties in Europe, I believe, that more or less do the same thing, right? There's no pirate party in Taiwan because our Ministry of Interior says we can't have a party name that's the same as a major criminal code, high-speed robbery, which is literally the same word. So we don't have a pirate party, but we have Gov0. So the point here, after facilitating the communication infrastructure of the Sunflower Movement, I'm very surprised to learn at the end of that all the mayoral candidates that supported this vision of open government, regardless of party affiliation, got elected, sometimes independent, sometimes they didn't prepare their own inauguration speech, right? So it's a sea change, and people have signaled very clearly that any mayoral candidate that didn't support a sunflower movement-like way of civil participation simply would not be given a political chance. And so right after the election, the public service enlisted my help as a reverse mentor, as a young mentor of sorts, to educate the career public service. There's exactly 300 level 12 or above high-level public service in the ranks. And so I started as a kind of facilitator and a coach to the public service. And then they really liked my message. And so I then helped facilitating conversations around what's hot in 2015, Uber, Airbnb, online liquor sales, and things like that, and crowdsourced the regulations around crowdfunding, closely held corporations. There's many more things around 2015 that governments around the world are just coming to terms with those emerging technologies. And so with this camaraderie, with the career public service, I kind of get promoted from internship to full-time, I guess, in 2015, from a mentor, intern at a minister's office to occupying, I guess, that minister's office.
That's amazing to hear. And I actually really want to jump into the Uber example to explain a bit what you mean. But first, I think let's take a second to dumb it down for all of us that are not tech experts. What do you mean in a couple of sentences by digital democracy?
Sure. So I want to introduce first two technical terms, bandwidth and latency. Bandwidth is how much information you can provide to other people. So if you vote in a ballot with just 4 people and you only have one choice, like in a presidential election, then that's just 2 bits of information, of bandwidth. Latency means you have to wait for this many time, a lag time, in order to express your next packet of information. So if you vote for your president once every 4 years, then the latency is 4 years. So in a sense, democracy, as we previously practiced it, representative democracy, means that each citizen only produces a few bits of information every few years when it comes to collective decision making. Now, of course, if you add referenda, that helps a little bit. You double the bandwidth, and the latency is shortened to maybe 1/2. But essentially, you're still only engaged with decision level democracy once a year or something like that. But in digital democracy, we can improve the bandwidth by, for example, we're having a video conference right now, and we're keeping a recording and releasing it in Creative Commons. So as a minister, all the interviews, all the lobbies, meetings, and so on with me are transcribed or published on YouTube this way. And this massively increases the bandwidth of democratic expression, because each and every one of Taiwanese citizens or even non-Taiwanese citizens who work as social innovators can book 40 minutes of my time every Wednesday to talk about any response they have to the social innovation they have seen in my YouTube channels or in my saved transcripts. And that's like just a few seconds of real-time video exchange is already more than the bits of all the votes that we're going to vote nowadays. So it reaches everyone. And then people worry about the bindingness, like whether you have to wait for 4 years for the next parliament to basically deploy such suggestions from the social innovators. But we have, for example, the e-petition platform that guarantees in 60 days a point-by-point response, implementation, or explaining why it cannot be implemented, but maybe the civil society can try it out themselves. And so within 60 days, so the latency is 60 days. Or in a presidential hackathon, the latency is around 90 days to 100 days from an idea in the civil society voted in through quadratic voting, the new voting system with more bits, and end up with presidential promise 5 every year to implement those ideas from the civil society and so on. So digital democracy is using digital technologies to expand the limitations inherent in the physical representative democratic systems in order to increase bandwidth, meaning that people can express more fully nuanced positions and ideas, and also reduce the latency, meaning that response is in the here and now, or at least just a few weeks afterwards, instead of having to wait for the next budget cycle or 4 years.
No, I love this from a government perspective. I think it leads to transparency, accountability, and also feeling closer, I guess, for citizens to their elected representative and vice versa. You mentioned before Uber and B&B, the licensing of alcohol and so on. Can you take us quickly through the case study of Uber? Because I think across Europe, at least, that was such a mess. Like the regulation of Uber was so complicated, and I think it's due to the fact that we don't necessarily lead by consensus, and we don't have a way, like you do, of bringing together often different opinions, different stakeholders into the room and discussing and giving them a voice to be able to come to a common conclusion.
So as you put it very well, it's not just about transparency. It's about working with the people, not just for the people in a transparent way. So we crowdsourced the agenda, meaning that we asked everyone, including taxi drivers, Uber drivers, passengers, and so on, for 3 weeks. We usually do 3 weeks because that's the time that we occupy the parliament, I guess. In 3 weeks, people can easily, on a system called Polis, post their feelings about the Uber situation. Now, we crowdsource for feelings, not for decisions, because the importance that we learned of the Occupy movement is to make sure that people feel that there is actually a good enough consensus across previous seen as divisive camps, that those camps are kind of illusory, that regardless of whether you are in the Uber camp or a taxi camp, actually everyone cares about, for example, passengers insurance. Everyone cares about a fair competition, so not undercutting existing meters. Everyone cares about empowering local, like in the less served rural places, the ideas of local temples or churches or co-ops, social entrepreneurs being able to form something like Uber and benefit from surge pricing and things like that. That is seen as a common good by people of either camp and so on. So I can go on, but as you can see, as you're nodding, I think in other jurisdictions, it works like that as well. But if you look at the political debates, they tend to, on mainstream media, focus on the one or two things that are kind of more ideological, like whether this is sharing economy or just gig economy, right? Whether this is a new form of work or it's just repackaged exploitation and so on. And I mean, this is worthy topics, but the problem is that it does not produce what I call the overlapping consensus. It's very difficult once you start with something ideological. But because we phrase the Uber conversation as, so imagine that you're someone who drives to work and you pick up strangers based on app recommendations. You charge them for it, but you do so 10 times a day. How do you feel about this situation? And so after 3 weeks, we do get the rough consensus, and everyone can see that actually most people agree with most of their neighbors on most of those values most of the time. And we agree to disagree on a few ideological things, but that's fine. Let's just regulate the rough consensus that we have. And then we gather the stakeholders, the Uber representatives, taxi union, and so on, and read to them the crowdsourced agenda, the common feelings, and only that, no other agenda. And of course, they're all nodding, right? They all agree with it. And so they can't help but say, okay, we'll commit ourselves to implement this kind of norm package that's already kind of collaboratively created with the civil society. And so that formed the Multi-Purpose Taxi Act of 2016, which is acting directly on the crowdsourced agenda in 2015, the Uber X conversation. After that, of course, Uber is now a legal Taiwanese taxi fleet, and the local rural temples, churches, and so on, they're all benefiting from this new crowdsourced multi-purpose taxi registration.
Very cool and very interesting also because in many other countries, like I'm Italian in Italy, you still don't have Uber because of this conflict, the ongoing conflict. Final question on the process. Is the government obliged to take on the outcome of the consultation, or is it a choice? And I'm asking that because in many jurisdictions we saw that participatory democracy sometimes fails because the government is not compelled to take on the recommendation, but just considered that.
Yeah, I think what we're crowdsourcing here is unlike a jury, which crowdsource final decisions. Here, what we're crowdsourcing is the norm. That is to say, the kind of solution space that the entire society feels comfortable with. And so, of course, we're obliged to deliver the final package somewhere within this solution space. And when it's very clearly defined, that has actually a higher binding power than a fine consensus, which people can spend decades, right, going over the details of the text and so on. So in a sense, we're obliged to deliver solutions within the space. But in the other sense, this doesn't directly produce a consensus text or something like that. It's not a consensus statement, but rather it is just an agenda, like we need to discuss based on this shared, how might we question that shared value systems that's already proven to be shared by the entire society. So it guides the conversation. We're obliged in that way, but it's not in itself decisional. And this also solves an important political question because the representatives are still there, right? They're still elected. If the panel from the crowdsourced digital democracy produce final decisions, and unless, of course, it's like participatory budgeting where they pre-allocate some form of budget to the crowd. Otherwise, the representative probably will feel threatened that their functions are essentially being replaced by the crowd. And so by specifically saying, no, the crowd takes care of the first diamond, right? Exploring the possibilities, defining the rough consensus, we leave the implementation and the delivery to the elected officials.
Yeah, and I guess it also makes the debate in Parliament easier in a way, right? If you already come with a consensus as to how people are feeling, it also sets the mood for the implementation regulation.
That's exactly right, yes.
But one last question on this before we move on a bit. So we talked about Uber, you mentioned Airbnb, sales of alcohol, and so on. And I think those are all incredible case examples of how Taiwan managed to regulate and come to consensus through digital democracy. What about some other global challenges? And the reason for which I'm mentioning this is we talk to people across the world about coming together beyond borders, using digital tools and so on, to be able to express themselves better, to come to unity in a way and consensus, as you mentioned. But we are often told, this works on some topics, but not on everything. So if you look at climate, for example, is it something that you're considering implementing? And I'm asking because I was reading up on Taiwan and the fact that it ranked, I think, 60th out of 63 countries in the latest annual climate change performance index. And every country has some areas to improve on, I think. I was wondering if, for example, those digital tools are something you are thinking of using or already using on global urgent challenges like climate change.
Yeah, if you go to energywhitepaper.pw, that's a model case of using this process to settle on the rough consensus of our energy transition, which was recently reinforced by the referenda results. So the answer is yes. But to kind of go into details a little bit, I don't think saying that let's have a conversation on climate works any more than let's have a conversation on the future of work. Works. If we start the Uber deliberation saying, let's talk about the future of work, then probably it would not lead anywhere. So the trick here is to be as specific as possible, lead with specific cases, motivating cases that people can feel kind of their gut feeling of right and wrong, a value system, their feelings can be shared more easily. But if you say, let's share your feelings about the future of the planet, that's kind of very difficult actually to converge to a shared how might we question. So yes, we've applied that to energy conversations, but no, we didn't talk about climate. We talk about specific energy transition routes.
Yeah, but so you are using those tools in order to try to mitigate somehow the impact of climate change and the change in the environment, even though it's not on the broader agenda.
So maybe that's the limitation of this line of thinking, because it depends on fully informed citizenry, but because it's the internet, right? So we only have maybe 10 minutes or 20 minutes of people's time at a time. So it needs to be something specific that they already feel somewhat attracted, I guess, or distracted, but at least a kind of emotional bond with the topic. If it's too abstract and impossible to explain in 20 minutes, then maybe it's not that easy for digital democratic tools to engage people with.
That's really interesting.
It's super interesting. Colombe, are we happy with the explanation?
We have so many questions.
Yeah, we can. I see we can have a 4-hour conversation.
So, for the benefit of our audience, let's move to the issue side. I mean, obviously, digital democracy has many beautiful sides, as we discussed. There are certain issues that I don't know about Taiwan, but definitely in other democracies like the United States, the UK, where we're based, have been definitely discussed at length. And we can refer to the case of Cambridge Analytica, Facebook, and other things that where technology meddled with democracy in a negative way. So I think that what we would like to hear from you is your general take on how did you try to edge this risk or convince people that these issues, this fear of technology ruining the outcome of a democratic election or process not based or maybe can be avoided.
I can sum it up with this, I think, McLuhan quote: "Don't hate the media, be the media." So don't hate the anti-social social media, make more pro-social social media. And so the point here is not to convince people that somehow Facebook is good for your mental. I wouldn't even try. But instead, saying that, you can actually go to a nightclub with a lot of secondhand smoke if you like, right? You're adults after all. And if you want to drink liquors, if you enjoy the company of very loud music and try to have a town hall conversation about Uber there, I mean, right. But it's your freedom. We're not going to stop you doing it, but we are going to build this town hall over here in the digital equivalent of university campus or digital equivalent of public library. And we're going to invite people to have a much more pro-social discussion in the space designed for this kind of policy making, not distracted by the advertisers or distracted by any other attention economy concerns, right? So I think that's why in 2016, for the first time, we say for the public infrastructure money in our forward-looking advanced infrastructure budget, we now say digital infrastructure in the digital realm is every bit as important, as worth investing as their concrete counterparts. So previous to that, most infrastructure money was just spent on things made out of concrete. But after that, it could be made out of bits. And that means that the people who specialize in building civic technologies, in building the kind of spaces where it's easier to get people to listen to one another than just shout at one another, have the funding to do so. And that's very important if we are to promote digital democracy. We certainly cannot rely on the digital equivalent of nightclubs suddenly rebranding themselves or rebuilding themselves as town halls. I don't think that's actually realistic.
I love this metaphor. And I think, we often think of spaces as and processes as the fact that the way they're built is very important, obviously. And you mentioned how, thanks to the tools you have, people are able to express feelings and see that they agree with one another on the majority of issues. And that's great. But we never think about the fact that the government also has a responsibility then in funding those spaces and making them happen. We kind of expect those spaces to happen on their own and just exist. So it's definitely something that we can bring to the attention of politicians and people across the world. So the way you build a space, the consensus building and so on enables people to speak in more details and to come to conclusions together. What about minorities? So in any consensus and majority kind of building processes, isn't there a risk that it would be the tyranny of the majority, or that some minority rights or freedoms would be left behind just because they are so small compared to the overall consensus that they wouldn't come into it? Do you have checks and balances to ensure that, for example, rights are always safeguarded regardless of the consensus?
Well, in Polis, the area is measured by the plurality of voices and never by the head count. The head count means nothing. If you get 2,000 people voting exactly the same way in Polis, it doesn't affect the shape at all. So basically, the algorithm looks for the plurality of voices. So a small number of people, say 20 people, if they hold a view that is distinct as another cluster of 20,000 people, but their suggestions are more diverse, then it actually gets a larger area. And so I think it's all in what you emphasize in. In Polis, we emphasize that the agenda must be from the people who are eclectic, nuanced. They need to resonate with people from all the different clusters. And we only hold ourselves accountable to answer to those ideas and feelings that resonates across all the clusters. So it becomes a friendly competition in a way, in that the people in the larger cluster, they need to bridge their values and their statements in a way that also makes sense to the smaller clusters, because they're not going away and everybody can see the distance to that. And so this is unlike many other antisocial corners of social media, where a large number of likes somehow means that this is better, and a smaller number of likes somehow means this is not good. And in Polis, if everybody in 20,000 people joining in a larger cluster press unlike on the smaller cluster statements, it just pulls themselves away, but it does not reduce the area of the smaller cluster.
That's actually extremely interesting because it's always a discussion, right? Like if you bring about the majority together, what happens to the minority? But if it's not about numbers, but about opinions and nuanced opinions and bridging the gap, then it kind of gamifies consensus and changes the whole game.
That's exactly right. Yes.
That's very cool to hear. Thank you so much for this explanation. I just want to linger 1 second on a final example that I think is very, very important for the time we live in. Today is obviously COVID.
We managed to go on for a very long time without speaking about COVID.
I know. The spirit of the new year, yes.
It is a miracle. But I still want to bring it up because obviously when you compare the numbers that Taiwan has achieved, despite every death is terrible, but you only had 850 deaths, I believe, up to now, while the country we live in, the United Kingdom, had 129,000. So these numbers are very different. Today, 34 new cases in Taiwan, and I think 220,000 in the United Kingdom. So clearly, we're in completely different situations. So can you tell us a bit more about how did you manage to achieve this result, and how digital tools and digital democracy played a role in this fantastic result?
Well, first of all, in the first day of 2020, we started border inspections and health checks for all flight passengers coming in from Wuhan to Taiwan. That's at least 10 days before pretty much everyone else, right? And the reason why is that the day before, the last day of 2019, Dr. Li Wenliang's message from Wuhan that there were 7 SARS cases in the Huanan seafood market made its way to PTT, Taiwan's equivalent of Reddit, except there's no shareholder or advertisers. It's a kind of digital equivalent of a university campus. It's a student pet project for 26 years, right? Open source, co-governed, all that. And so people on PTT do not spend their time on advertisements, but rather triaged this message very quickly, so that by the next day, we started responding to this new strain of SARS. And I think this shows the beauty of digital democracy, because digital democracy relies on the collective intelligence, which is always several steps ahead of the government's intelligence in things like this. And so if we take away the freedom of speech, of assembly, of the press, and so on, we don't get advance warnings or indeed warnings of any kind. And so this is how PTT, I think, established itself as for collective intelligence for many things related to COVID in the 2020 and 2021. So that's the first thing. And so then we, of course, need to take care of people who are not that familiar with the bulletin board system that's mostly text-based. You talk about minorities, so inclusion is very important. So very quickly, we set up 1922, which is a toll-free phone number that anyone can call using their landline, which is a huge call center that escalates collective intelligence from people who prefer landlines, phone calls, into the same Central Epidemic Command Center, who every 2 p.m. responds to the popular calls the previous day, in addition to the journalistic inquiries. So for example, 2020 April, there was a young boy call saying, "Your rationale mask, that's great, but all I got was pink, which is not great. All the boys have navy blue mask. I didn't want to wear pink to school." And the very next 2 p.m., everyone wore pink, regardless of their gender, in the CECC press conference. And the Central Epidemic Commander, Mr. Chen, even said Pink Panther was his childhood hero. So with this great gender mainstreaming work, I'm sure that the boy became the most hip boy in the class, for only he has the color that the heroes and heroes hero wear. And so pink mask, rainbow mask, whatever mask became a fashion statement. And that massively increased the kind of people who want to wear a mask to protect themselves against their own unwashed hands. And so that was quite sufficient to fight off, even before the vaccines, the kind of entire year of 2020. But after, of course, the Alpha and then later on Delta variants, mask alone is not sufficient. So the GovZero community then co-created a privacy-preserving QR code mechanism to do contact tracing, but without any app required. You just scan it with your own camera. It sends an SMS toll-free to 1922, a trusted number, and that's done. But your telecom stores it, not the government. So the government doesn't know where you have been to. The telecom doesn't know either, because the 15-digit random code is only known by the venue and the QR code printer, but they don't have your phone number. So through something we call multi-party security, as part of the privacy-enhancing technologies, people can rest assured that after 28 days with no cases locally, their records will be deleted and there will be no kind of privacy impact on their whereabouts and so on. And so that shortened the contact tracing from more than 24 hours to less than 24 minutes automatically since July. And that's how we fought out our first and really the only wave so far of the Alpha and Delta variants. And then, of course, is the mass vaccination that are now helping us to fight off the Omicron variant.
Thank you so much for this. I think one, it shows how advanced Taiwan is, not only on tech, but also on privacy. But I think you also addressed a question that I wasn't going to ask, which is the digital gap, because through calls and so on, it makes it easier, I guess, for people who are not literate with tech, computers, smartphones, and so on, to be able to participate in democratic life, have a say, and get informed. We are almost done. We just want to look a bit at the future with two questions. One of them, and you mentioned it at the beginning of our conversation, that you have other countries that are on the path of digitalization, might be taking a slightly different path, but there are other examples. You mentioned Japan, for example. I wanted to know, in the whole wide world, what are the countries you look to for digital democracy? I know that Estonia is often referred to, for example, but are there other countries, cities, regions, anything that we should also pay attention to and learn from?
Yeah, we're engaging quite seriously since last year when we published our National Action Plan on Open Government, the Open Government Partnership, or the OGP. So all the OGP member countries and member civil society organizations are our peers. And I personally attended many OGP summits and also attended the Open Response, Open Recovery, the OGP Academy, and Taiwan Stories also on ogpstories.org. Although we're not a full member yet due to well-known reasons, we're working on that. And so that's one community that I will just highlight. And in privacy in particular, since it seems to be your favorite, one of your favorite topics as well, where we're also sending expert delegates to the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence, because over-centralized centralized AI tends to be kind of authoritarian in nature, even in democratic countries. And so privacy preserving technologies or privacy by design, I mean, need to be part of the education of everyone working in the AI fields. And the GPAI is now seeing this. So Taiwan is also contributing via our expert to the data governance pillars in the GPAI. So the GPAI member countries are also the peers we're engaging with.
Fantastic. My last question on this kind of future-looking pieces. What's next? I mean, you're doing lots of exciting stuff, and obviously I don't know what you can share, but are you looking to enter with the Taiwanese government to new areas of technology? For example, a classic example that we see these days is Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies, with El Salvador's experiment of making like a legal currency with a lot of drawbacks. So what's next for Taiwan?
Yeah, well, full disclosure, I'm digital minister in Taiwan, but I'm also board in 7 international NGOs, one of which is Radical Exchange with fellow board member Vitalik Buterin. So we know something about blockchain governance, and we see the blockchain governance space not particularly about blockchain, but about starting a lot of small but important experiments on how to take the consensus to the next level. Maybe consensus on intersectional social identities, maybe consensus on not just the norms, but also how the norms can be translated or compiled into regulations, so law as code, right? And there's many things in the distributed ledger community space that they're working on. And one part that I'm really excited is in the homomorphic encryption and zero knowledge stuff, but this is not a technical conference, so I'll be brief. Basically, it enables us to solve the issue of data aggregation. Previously, if you trust your clinic and your clinic trusts a cloud computing provider, it doesn't mean you trust that cloud computing provider. And with many more aggregation like this, at some point, everyone suffers a catastrophic privacy or some other breach, right? And then everyone's loss in the system is paramount because trust is very easy to break, but very hard to rebuild. And so these privacy enhancing technologies that grow from the distributed ledger space, because in the public blockchain, there's really nowhere to hide, right? So they emphasize on zero knowledge. So the point here is maybe I encrypt my data, I offer it for you to compute, and you compute without looking in the data, much like how you can shuffle some balls in a safe without opening the safe. And then you can return that safe to me, and I decrypt and get a result, but with zero knowledge from this safe to you about the data that's actually being computed by you. So things like this offers new possibilities that let us not think about usability of data, public good of data, and privacy is a trade-off, but rather privacy enhancing technology as trust building, democracy affirming technologies that can be the backbone of data coalitions and data trust and so on. And so I think in the Europe, I think it's called data altruism organizations or joint controllership or things like that. And I'm very excited to work with people in this space to make sure that the data is good to be shared with all, but with zero privacy impact.
Super cool.
I have so many questions, but we're coming to the end. Thank you so much for this, because we also, on a side note, we're working on a few projects on what a digital state going beyond borders could look like, created by citizens and so on. And so this leads perfectly into how to ensure privacy. Thanks so much for taking the time, Audrey. It's been incredible to speak to you about digital democracy. I think we will need at least 10 follow-up conversations.
Yeah, it's been very enriching, to be honest. I hope we're going to continue this conversation because I think this is the future. Thank you so much, Audrey. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for the great questions. It's clear that you've done your own research, and maybe by the next time we have a conversation, I can also learn about your research as well.
I really hope so. Thank you so much, Audrey.
Thank you. Live long and prosper. Bye.
Bye.